On today's show, the latest news around the Atlanta Hawks, from a new hire to an old friend back in the NBA, and your mailbag questions as often on this program. All of that and more on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1486 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday evening into Tuesday here in early June. And today's podcast is brought to you by the Gametime app. Create an account. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Also want to take the top of the podcast to make us your first listen each and every day, and subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube on the video side, all those fun places. And today's show will be basically a smorgasbord, let's just say. Some news at the top of the podcast, some mailbag questions, and the NBA draft is about 2.5 weeks away, so the offseason is getting ready to ramp up in a big way. I do want to tell you at the top of the podcast, if you've been missing anything on the episode front on this show, there's plenty to catch up on, honestly. I've been talking about the player capsules with Glenn Willis of Peachtree Hoops and ATL 129, talking about all kinds of guys on the roster in sort of standalone form. Most recently, on Monday, I released a show about Onyeka Congo with Glenn. I talked about AJ Griffin and Jalen Johnson, Sadiq Bey, Bogdan Bogdanovic, etc. There's more to come on that front, but those are still very much relevant at this point in time. Also, a 3-part NBA draft episode that I did last week with Ben Pfeiffer, talking about everything from the top of the draft to the Hawks picks to the second round sleepers, etc. All that is coming, and we'll have more draft content on the way, including later on in this podcast as I answer your questions about all kinds of things. So it's been very busy. Even in the offseason, we don't really take a lot of time off in this space. So please subscribe to the podcast, tell a friend, and we'll dive into the news right now. So the big news on Monday was that Brittni Donaldson is going to be a member of the Hawks coaching staff. Jeff Schultz of The Athletic reporting on Monday that the Hawks have added her to the staff. She was recently served with the Pistons and the Raptors. She is the first female coach in the history of the Hawks franchise. Her job will be reportedly focused on analytics. She is 30 years old, was assistant coach last year, as I mentioned before, but also the director of coaching analytics for the Pistons. Before that, she was on the Raptors staff, where she actually got a title, got a ring, actually, as a member of the Raptors staff. She is joining Igor Kokoskov as the lead assistant. Antonio Lang and Mike Bray are all the staff as well. There are also a couple of different staffers that Quinn Snyder brought in the middle of last season that could be staying over, that were with him in Utah. So pretty much a full overhaul of the assistant group. Not a surprise there, but Donaldson comes with very, very high marks around the league. I don't know her personally, but certainly have been making calls and texts and messages about her work in Detroit and in Toronto, and gotten a lot of positive feedback from that. Should be a good addition to the franchise, to the organization. So a whole new staff to evaluate. Snyder, of course, an upgrade in my mind on the bench. So that's certainly big news as of Monday. The Hawks have not announced anything with regard to the assistants just yet, but it's been double confirmed, all that fun stuff, along with Bray and Lang and Kokoskov. And at some point, the Hawks, I'm sure, will announce their full staff, but not just yet. Elsewhere, Travis Schlenk, old friend, is back in the league officially. Woj reported last week, I believe it was on Thursday, that Travis will be joining the Wizards staff as the senior VP of player personnel. And the way it was reported by both Woj and then later Jeff Schultz, Travis seems to be kind of in the number 3 role with the Wizards under Michael Winger, who just took over as the president of the entire operation that covers the Wizards and the Mystics and all kinds of stuff in Washington, D.C. But they're also hiring a GM in between Winger and Travis. I've always said this, but Travis's strength as a front office person is certainly in his scouting and player evaluation rather than the actual process stuff. Anytime there was really an issue with Travis as the head guy in Atlanta, it was really the process part of things, not the talent evaluation, where he's been really good at that for a long time. They met the Golden State. Not perfect, because nobody is, but certainly a lot of hits on his resume in a positive way. So just wanted to at least note that. Lots of questions about that, but Travis was always going to come back to the league, you would imagine, at some point in time, and the Hawks paid him a lot of money to not be there anymore. He was under contract for a large sum, and after the extension that he got, and certainly earned after that big run the Hawks made, but he is landed elsewhere and within the same division as the Hawks in the Southeast. So that's a pretty interesting subplot to follow in the coming days. Also, the NBA draft, as I mentioned before, is looming 2.5 weeks or so from right now. Thursday, the 22nd, is when that's going to be coming in full force. And draft workouts for the Hawks resumed last week after a bit of a hiatus around the combine and sort of a post-combine break of sorts. And Friday's group was the best one yet for the Hawks in terms of quality of prospects they actually had in the building. They had Chris Murray, who in my mind is a top 20 guy in this class, certainly for me anyway, in contention. At least it would be for me for the 15th pick in the draft. He is that kind of prospect. Also, they had Max Lewis and Omax Prosper and Ben Shepherd, all of whom rank between, I don't know, something like 25 and 35 or 40 on a lot of boards. So late first round contenders, and those three guys. Mike Miles of TCU came in, certainly a high-profile college player and could be a second-round pick. Also, Pete Nance was a part of that group as well. But lots of intriguing talent. A lot of the early workouts, and this is certainly not out of the ordinary by any means. We're focused on kind of later second-round pick guys. That was kind of one that included a bunch of first-round talent. Since then, they had some more second-round candidates on Monday, and the biggest headliner actually changed a little bit tonight. So originally on the Tuesday workout list for the Hawks, they announced that Cason Wallace of Kentucky, freshman guard from Kentucky, was on the list. And that drew a lot of attention, including from me. That was the first time that the Hawks had a guy projected as a lottery pick on the list to be working out. But only a couple hours later, the Hawks announced that he would not be participating anymore. Not a huge surprise here, but the Hawks gave no other context, nor would they ever, as to why he's not participating, but they just kind of replaced him. All that is. And people were panicking, asking why. And I just would say, I wouldn't panic about this really at all from the Hawks standpoint. It could be anything. I saw a lot of assumptions being made by fans and even people that cover the draft about, this is a promise or whatever. It could be, certainly. I've not seen anything about that at this point in time. It could be anything from travel concerns to him being under the weather and not 100% ready to play, or maybe it could be a change of heart. Maybe it could just be a promise, whatever it could be. I would not assume anything dire there, or that there's definitely a promise or anything like that. And honestly, most players with Wallace's profile as a projected lottery pick don't work out for teams in the Hawks position. And when I say that, I mean that at number 15 overall, it's kind of a weird place. It's kind of in the middle where the Hawks, I'm sure, can get anyone projected outside the top 20 to come in and work out for them, because why wouldn't they? On the off chance that they impress or whatever. But if you are a projected lottery pick, you don't want to work out for a 15th pick team because you don't want to fall that far. And last year, as an example of this, that's very, very timely and relevant, AJ Griffin was a projected lottery pick. He fell to the Hawks. He had not worked out for the Hawks in person. He had not talked to the Hawks in person, maybe at the combine, but he had not been to Atlanta for a visit. And the Hawks took him anyway, because that's what happens. As long as you're comfortable with the medical, you don't have to have a workout, because, and really the last several years, the Hawks have drafted multiple players in the first round that have not worked out for them. So that's not going to be a problem at all. And again, I've said this a million times. I'm sure I'll say it even more in the next couple of weeks. There seems to always be a player or two that are widely projected to be in the top 10, 12 picks that fall in the middle of the first round. Last year was AJ. Jalen Johnson fell further than expected. John Collins back in the day fell further than expected to get to the Hawks. So that's just the Hawks examples, but this happens pretty much every year. It could be Cason Wallace. I'm not saying it's going to be. Could be Grady Dick. Could be Anthony Black. Could be whoever that's going to be. But it's not a huge surprise that someone like Wallace would not come to Atlanta. It was more of a surprise that he was on the list than him actually canceling, in my opinion. So while we're here, I'll just say this. I have Wallace in my top 10. I think he is probably the best case scenario of any player that could reasonably fall to 15. He's not going to be number one on my board or anything like that. But as far as I think there's probably 6-7 guys in this draft that have basically no chance, barring a weird medical thing, to fall to 15. And everybody else is at least a chance. And of those guys, I think that Wallace is arguably the best case scenario for Atlanta. I have him in the 8 to 10 range on my board. And because of that, obviously, I would love that pick at 15 overall. I think he and Anthony Black have been the two guys that I have circled as potential guys to fall. I think Black seems to be, at least according to the mainstream boards, a little bit ahead of Wallace right now in terms of the eyes of the NBA team. So that's why I'm saying Wallace. But I think Wallace, Black, maybe Taylor Hendricks are the guys, those guys. They're like the maybe Grady Dick. That 4-player group is maybe one of those guys falls to Atlanta. I still would say probably not, but it's possible for sure. And I'll just say this, it's easy to get excited about Cason Wallace's defense and his intriguing profile, but I would not go crazy about this. I know fans are going to do that anyway, but he was coming and now he's not coming anymore as I record this podcast deep into the night on Monday. Last thing on the news front on today's show. I got a couple questions about Chris Haynes and something he said on a podcast in late May. It's been about a week and a half now or something like that. This is kind of a nothing burger in my mind, but at least worth sort of talking about because I got asked about it a couple times. So I did a whole podcast, or at least part of a podcast, about the non-rumor reporting about the Lakers holding internal discussions about Trey Young. I kind of laughed that off. I think that's what Haynes was responding to, but I'm going to read the quote that he gave on that podcast. Quote, from what I've heard, there's nothing brewing with Trey Young and the Hawks. There hasn't been anything or anything like that to request a trade. Nothing like that has happened with Trey. Nothing. End quote. So yeah, that's where I am too. I've said this before, but I think there's nothing to indicate that Trey is not going to be on the team next year. I believe that he's in that tier of player that's going to have to ask out to be traded. And I think, there's no indication that he's going to be able to do that. So I think that you plan this if he's going to be there. And I just wanted to answer that question on the podcast. Not really a question, but like people were like, did you see this? Yes, I saw it and heard it, but nothing really to take away from that. I think it's just kind of all normal. And the people that kind of panicked about the Trey Lakers thing, I wouldn't worry about that really at all. I think Trey Young is the centerpiece of the Hawks. And until that changes, it doesn't change. And here we are. Okay. Without any further delay, I will get into the mailbag. I do thank you for all the mailbag questions, by the way, as we'll get into this in a second. But first, before we dive into your questions, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. If you've ever been trying to find tickets for a big event at the last minute, it can be really stressful. Probably not the best idea for your emotions or your wallet. After all, buy tickets should not be a hassle with Gametime. It's the fastest, easiest way to buy tickets for sports, music, comedy, and theater. They have killer deals, last minute tickets, and the best price guarantee. And you can start avoiding all the stress that comes along with buying stuff and actually getting hyped for the fun that you'll have at the event. Summer is here. There's stuff happening all around me in Atlanta. I'm sure there is around you as well. And with Gametime, you get the flash deals and last minute tickets. It's so easy to find and buy tickets for any kind of event you're looking for. You also see images of where you're actually going to be sitting in the venue, and they have protection if your event happens to be canceled. Forget all the months of planning. They have the deals on tickets right up to the day of the event with Gametime. And the Gametime guarantee also means you get the best possible price. If you find tickets in the same section, in the same row for less, you'll be credited 110% of the difference with Gametime. It's the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. You can buy tickets just a matter of seconds. Plus, the tickets will actually be sent directly to you and your phone to make things very easy. Download the Gametime app right now, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem that promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off with Gametime. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, it is mailbag time, and a question from Billy on the draft here. I want to know, this is the question, I want to know what you think about ESPN's latest mock draft. And it seems like that is the one that gets the most attention, and I didn't love it. That's from Billy. I thought it was funny that the question came in without actually mentioning who the Hawks picked in that mock projection. So as of right now, ESPN's most recent mock draft is projecting Baylor guard Keontae George to Atlanta. That's Jonathan Givony and Jeremy Woo. By the way, Jeremy Woo is formerly Sports Illustrated, been on this podcast before. Great guy. Before I talk about the pick, ESPN's mocks do get the most attention. That's just ESPN's machine, and they have good intel. Givony is not like a great analyst, but he's a great intel guy. Always knows a lot about the draft as far as like what teams are going to do. Jeremy's a good analyst. So I think the only other one that's like gets almost the same level of attention is my friend Sam Vecini at The Athletic, who's been on the show multiple times. Sam is a friend of mine, but I think he does a great job. And honestly, both ESPN and The Athletic, they move more towards intel as the draft actually arrives, because crucially, mock drafts are not the same as big boards. Mock drafts are meant to be projections, whereas big boards are like how you feel about the draft, how a person feels about the draft. So keep that in mind. Mocks, not the same as big boards. Anyway, I think my answer on Keontae George is that he'd be an okay pick at 15 overall. I won't give the full scouting report on this podcast because we'll do more of that later on. I've done it before on this show and in a couple different ways, but he's a 6'4" guard from Baylor, can play on and off the ball. I like the shooting. Defensively and athletically, some questions about Keontae George. I think he's a very worthy mid-first round pick and an interesting creator prospect, but I would not have picked him in the way that ESPN's mock draft broke down. Again, I would certainly encourage you not to worry about mock drafts, especially right now with singular mock drafts. But the biggest thing is on that mock from ESPN, to answer the question, is that Cason Wallace fell behind Keontae George, and I like Wallace considerably more than George. I have him about a half tier higher than George, so that's what I would have done. I would have taken Wallace. A couple other guys, I actually have Chris Murray and Kobe Lufkin a little bit ahead of Keontae George as well on my Hawks-centric board. So the only one that really bothered me in that one is Cason Wallace. Everything else is kind of the same tier, just personal preference stuff, but I think if the Hawks took Keontae George, it would be totally fine. It wouldn't bother me at all. And as I said before, the Hawks, there's probably like a 10, 12, 14 player list of guys who I think would be just fine where the Hawks pick. And it will all depend on who's on the board and still available at 15 overall, which we can't really know. That makes things very tricky at this point in time, but we will update that as we go forward. All right. Question from Yogi, who says, do you think Tyrese Martin will make the Hawks main roster this season? So it's pretty tough to answer this question right now, but I think it's intriguing too, because Tyrese is a big guy we haven't talked about a lot. I talked about with Glenn a little bit on a player capsule, but second round pick from last year, of course, And for many teams, I've said this before, but Martin would have been on a two-way contract last year. The Hawks chose to have him on a full contract because he was so cheap and it was helpful against the cap. But he played 66 minutes for the big league club last year and spent most of the season in College Park. That's very normal for a player drafted in the 50s where he was chosen, but it's kind of just he was off the radar for a lot of the season. He played fine in the G League. Still very much up for debate as to like whether he's actually be a real piece of the roster moving forward. They have a decision to make on his contract as well, which I think is maybe why Yogi is asking this question. And I talked about it a little bit a second ago, but he was so cheap last year. Like for instance, it was cheaper to carry Martin for about $1 million on his rookie minimum contract than it would have been to sign a non-rookie to a deal in that slot. And the Hawks were very nearly in the tax. So they also got a non-guaranteed contract on his second season, which can be valuable as well. So his deal for this coming season is $1.7 million, but it doesn't guarantee until July 21st. And for the most part, the Hawks' business will be done by then. So they can move on from him at any point if they need a roster spot or they want to clear some money or they just don't see it with Martin anymore. I think Summer League will be interesting on that front. So that flexibility puts him in limbo for sure. I think it gets a little bit even more uncertain because Travis Schlenk was the one that drafted Martin. He's not there anymore either. So it's less clear how this organization feels about Martin at this point in time. I'm not saying that they don't like him. We just don't know that as much. So Ledger Fields was around when that pick was made, as were the wrestlers, both Tony and Nick. But Quinn Snyder was not, and there is a new direction. Plus that $1.7 million for this year is not quite as cheap as it was for last year, which again was part of the value of having him on the roster. So long story short, the answer is I don't know at this point. I would not assume Martin is on the team. He is non-guaranteed. If he was guaranteed, it'd be more of an assumption, but they could move on from him for nothing. So that's part of the calculus. I think that Summer League would be interesting. The Hawks have said basically nothing about who's going to play in Summer League, but I have to imagine that Tyrese Martin will be playing there unless he's hurt. He is an older guy as well for someone who is this young in the league. He was an older draftee, so maybe a little bit less time to mature. But we'll see. I think he doesn't guarantee until after Summer League is over. So they have time to evaluate him, but it will all depend on what else happens with the roster and how this front office and how Quinn Snyder feels about Tyrese Martin as to whether he'll be on the team for next year. Question from Paul, who says, I did not listen to your finals preview until after game 2, so I'm late on that. But what do you think about the series now after Miami won game 2? So I talked to Bill DeFilippo about the finals last week in brief fashion. I'm going to check that podcast out because there was some Hawk stuff at the beginning of that podcast, but I did pick Denver in the series. I would still pick Denver now. They are still the betting favorite. I know FanDuel, our friends over there, had them like minus 275 to win the series, so a pretty big favorite still. But that result definitely gives Miami a much better chance at 1-1 than they had before the series started because they stole a road game. It's that simple in a lot of ways. Now it's a shorter series, and Miami has home court. So that's a huge part of the acknowledgement there. I did say on the show with Bill, and I'll say it again now, I've been too low on Miami during the playoffs. I did pick them against New York. That was one I was confident in, the Heat winning that series. But honestly, I will just admit to you now, it breaks my brain with Miami a little bit right now. They were number 25 in the league in offense this year. They were outscored for the entire regular season. They had a negative point differential without huge injury concerns. But they're making shots in the playoffs at a level that is just carrying them, to be honest. Now, early in the playoffs, against Milwaukee in particular, Jimmy Butler was unbelievable. And that's why they were winning. He was that good. But since the middle of the Boston series, I would say maybe early in the Boston series, he's not been that dominant, but it hasn't mattered because they're getting so much shot making from Gabe Vincent and Caleb Martin. And now Duncan Robinson and Max Strus had a huge game in game 2. And it's not statistically likely to happen, but if Miami keeps doing this from 3-point range, they can win, obviously. Cooper Moorhead, who covers the Heat, actually and works for the Heat, he's actually a team employee, shared the stat today that Miami is shooting 46.9% from 3 in their 9 playoff wins against Milwaukee, Boston, and Denver. So basically, they are shooting an incredible percentage when they win against good teams. That's a good indicator of how they're doing that, number one. Cooper also added this. This is even crazier. They're shooting 48.7% on threes classified as heavily contested in those games. That is ludicrous. That means those are not open shots. They're just making incredible shots. So this is not Locked on Heat or Locked on Nuggets or even Locked on NBA. So I'm not going to keep going on this too long. But the discourse about game 2 also frustrated me a little bit as well because Miami's defense in that game was getting the attention, which is not really what happened in that game. They just kind of outscored Denver. Miami got credit and should get credit for this. They had a couple of good stretches defensively. I think early in the game and then also in the fourth quarter, they played good defense. But all the talk about making Jokic a score or whatever is going on there because the Nuggets had a 124 offensive rating. That is excellent. It's already better than Denver's already great offense this year. The difference in the game, very obviously, was Miami shooting 49% from three and having a 129 offensive rating in the game. They scored almost every possession in the fourth quarter. It was actually very, very impressive. Again, make no mistake, they played great basketball in the fourth quarter. They deserve a lot of credit for that. Denver didn't execute defensively, but it's not like Miami's stopping them. So that's part of that. I've seen a lot of people talk about like the point totals. The pace of play has been very slow, but as an efficiency perspective, Denver is scoring plenty. It's that Miami just is burying them with offense, at least they were in the fourth quarter. Also, I could do a whole segment about how bad Michael Porter Jr. was in game two. Like, I can't believe anyone with a profile the way that Porter has, like, he's a good player. Obviously, I've always been a little bit lower on him, but he's a good player. As talented as he is, I don't think I remember anybody ever with that kind of pedigree being as bad as he was in game two. It was terrible, not only offensively, but the defensive breakdowns. Like, I would recommend you watching him defensively in that game. He was actively harmful to Denver. And also KCP, a guy I really like, of course, a Georgia product. He was really bad too in that game. I forget who had this stat, but KCP fell out of the game with 6 fouls, and his 6 fouls led directly to 14 free throws. So more than 2 free throws per foul. That is impossibly bad, and that's some of the reasons why Miami was so good in the game. Anyway, long story short, I'd pick the Nuggets in a series still, but Miami definitely has a chance. They keep doing this, so credit to Spo, credit to Jimmy, credit to their supporting cast. They're playing great, and they have a chance for sure. I'd still pick Denver, but just to answer the question in full, I'm leaning Denver, but a little bit less confidently because anytime you lose a home game, things get a little bit more hairy than they would have been before the series. All right, we have more questions to answer on the podcast, but first, a word from our sponsors on the show today. Today's show is brought to you by the award-winning app at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. It's amazing that I know that you will love it as well. It is very easy to use, and PrizePicks has safe and fast withdrawals when you win, and every single day. During the NBA playoffs, one PrizePicks user will actually have the chance to become a millionaire. One entry can be actually placed after 8 a.m. Eastern time will be randomly selected each day, and whoever placed the entry will be given a 6-pick flex with the following payouts. 6 out of 6 will win $1 million, 5 out of 6, $80,000, 4 out of 6, $60,000. And these details can be found at prizepicks.com/million. You must opt in at that link to be eligible for the $1 million entry. Once you opt in, all you actually have to do is actually go and play the game as normal. You could be the lucky winner with PrizePicks. Download the app right now. Go to prizepicks.com, sign up, play daily fantasy sports. And if you're a first-time user, get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKED ON. Don't forget that promo code. It is locked on. At sign up for the instant deposit match up to $100. Check it out now at PrizePicks. And one more time, the URL is prizepicks.com/million. All right, question from Charlie, who says, this is actually a long question. Is there a player that you think has an optimal skill set to play with Trey Young? And this is Charlie still talking. He says, I guess I'm talking mostly about fit. For example, he uses the fit with Klay Thompson and Steph Curry as far as what makes the Warriors champions. I'm trying to shorten the question a little bit here. Do you think that there's a current player that could do something similar with Trey? And then he mentions Jaylen Brown and Zion Williamson, etc. Not a brain topic, obviously, but there's something to be said for the archetypes of what you would want with Trey Young if you could just choose whatever you wanted. One of those archetypes is a two-way wing player who can create shots for himself and others, make threes, and also defend. Now, that's obviously a great player archetype no matter what, but especially around Trey. I think, he mentioned Jaylen Brown. That's a good example. Although Brown is not a good creator for other people, he is definitely more of a scorer. He's actually a pretty bad passer, ball handler for a primary wing. But I think, honestly, I've said this for a while, but the best wing you could probably create for Trey Young is Jason Tatum, not Jaylen Brown. Jason Tatum is better than Jaylen Brown at basically everything, other than he's not as good of an athlete, but Tatum's a little bit longer. He's a better shooter, probably. He's a better defender, better ball handler, better passer, etc. So obviously Tatum's not really attainable, but as far as like in a perfect world, you would probably take someone like Tatum, who's like more of a top 15 player in my mind than a top 5 player, but certainly checks a lot of boxes. And I think it'd be better for Tatum too to have a guy like Trey who can kind of carry the offense sometimes. Anyway, you might also go with a little bit less high profile player. If you want to go with like Mikal Bridges would be a good fit with Trey on the wing. Obviously a really good defender, good shooter, a little bit less creation, but certainly can score a little bit as well. Those are not easy players to get. I understand that. That's why it's a hypothetical question. To the point about Zion and front court players, I think that Zion would be an incredible fit with Trey offensively, but defensively, I would not choose Zion because it'd be a little bit rough there. I think the prime, best, healthy version of Anthony Davis is probably the front court player that I would choose to play with Trey because he's a great defender, great pick and roll man. The shooting is not what it used to be for AD, but he can at least shoot it a little bit. And when he's right, he's an absolute monster. I would not go for the entire roster construction, but basically, as far as like perfect around Trey, you can argue this all day long. I do think, though, that if you were choosing just two things to have next to Trae, it would be a two-way wing and a big that is versatile enough that can defend and can finish around him. Maybe that's going to be a Congo in the future. Maybe that's going to be a Griffin in the future. We'll see. But that's what I would go with. I think that people also tend to ignore defense, which is why the Zion thing comes up sometimes. Even Jaylen Brown is like a solid defender, not a great defender. But I think it's especially important with Trae, for obvious reasons, to have better defensive players because he's never going to be good defensively. He could be better than he's been. I think this year he was better than he was previous years, but he's always going to be limited there. So when you're building an actual like true contending team, you've got to factor in defense, I think, more than most teams even do. And of course, I love defense as a general construct. Okay. Question from Steve, who says, why does anyone think or talk about Okongwu playing the 4 with Capella at the 5? His shot can get there. I think we should actually get Jalen Johnson closer to the ball on offense to utilize his playmaking and guarding threes on defense. That makes us bigger and better on defense. Everyone talks about O being versatile, especially if he was guarding 4s. Okay, so it's been a while since this was really a talking point, but there has been plenty of talk in previous years about Okongwu and Capella playing together. But I'll just kind of refresh it a little bit now because, Okongwu was drafted right after they traded for Clint, so it was a talking point a lot at that point in time. The consensus from the team and also outside the team is that's not really a partnership that they are willing to try, and at least in a larger sense. We've seen it in very tiny samples on defense-only possession, stuff like that. But I think that Okongwu and Capella defensively would work very well because Okongwu is so mobile, and having two great defending bigs would be awesome defensively. But offensively, it really wouldn't work at this point in time. To what Steve is saying in the question, Okongwu's shot is a work in progress. We've seen a little flashes on this. Obviously, it's not going to be respected just yet as a shooter, but it's really hard to play those guys together for spacing and creation reasons, pretty obviously. Now, it's not impossible to do that if Okongwu continues to grow as a playmaker, like in the way that Golden State's done with Draymond and Looney at times. But, for example, that Warriors team that does that has the best shooter of all time on it, plus another top 10 shooter of all time in Clay, and still has some offensive issues at times when they play Draymond and Looney together. Also, I talked about Okongwu a lot with Glenn on yesterday's show. Capella has already actually been recorded. That'll be coming later on in this month. So just not going to go crazy about this topic, but I do think that there is a world where they can play together more. I kind of wish they had tried it at some point, but I do understand why, and it's been very clear why. It's because of the offense, and it's really hard to play two total non-shooters. And Okongwu is not a total non-shooter anymore, but he's not proven to be a shooter at this point in time. The other question, by the way, that was asked by Steve about Jalen getting out on the floor, we saw that more with Quinn, Jalen guarding perimeter players. He's still a perfect example of a guy who really couldn't ever play with Okongwu and Capella because that's like a comical amount of non-shooting. If you had Jalen at the 3 with Okongwu and Capella, yeah, defensively it would be just wrecking crew stuff. They just couldn't score with that group. So that'd be that's why that would be sort of untenable. In a vacuum, Jalen's defensive ability should help the team a lot moving forward. And as I talked about with Glenn on that player capsule with Jalen, it's actually easier to protect his defense right now than his offense in a lot of ways. But long story short, I think that if they were to bring back Capella and Okongwu, I would be interested to see how it would work. But you kind of have to surround that duo with 3 like really good shooters. Something like if you were to try that group, I would probably want to play it with like Trae, Bogey, and Bay, or Trae, Bogey, and AJ. Like really offense focused on the perimeter with a lot of spacing, because otherwise I don't know what you'd be able to do as far as creation with the lack of space that you have on offense. We'll answer one more quickly here at the end of the podcast. I'm trying to find one that's quick. Okay, here's one from Tyler, not that Tyler. The Hawks roster is relatively young in age as well as limited in NBA experience, with the oldest player being Bogey and even more limited in playoff experience. How big of an effect do you think that it is on mentality and finding ways to win in the postseason or even during some of the slogs of the regular season? You think the Hawks should look for available veterans in the offseason? So it's a good question. I think that the Hawks are younger than a lot of teams are. As much as I referred to Bogey and Clint as old guys, they're not really that old. And the Hawks, since Vince Carter left, haven't really had that true old guy. Now, Solomon Hill was an old head in a lot of ways. Solomon Hill was still only like 30, but he was sort of that older fringe veteran that didn't play a lot. The Hawks haven't really had that guy. So I'm not saying you have to have that guy for sure, but I think adding some more experience would not be the worst thing in the world, deeper onto the bench. Maybe cheaply. Maybe you get a guy at the end of his career that's more of that kind of figurehead, maybe plays a little bit, not like full-on Udonis Haslem, but certainly someone who has a little bit more seasoning. I do think, though, that the Hawks, while they are young, are not like crazy, crazy young anymore. Trae's been around the block now for a while. DeJounte Murray's seen a lot of things in the league. Capella, of course, same thing. Bogey, same thing. But yeah, could they use another 35-year-old on the roster somewhere? Sure, they probably could, deep in the bench. And I think that you wouldn't like prioritize that. But I think if you're at the end of the bench in like the middle of July, late July, you have some minimums to hand out. You want to add an old guy. Maybe it wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. I think if Solomon Hill was still in the league, like actively, he would be a great guy to have around. He's not that old, but I got similar sort of playing style. They had Lou Williams, who was in his mid 30s, but yeah, last year they didn't really have that guy. Wouldn't be the worst idea in the world, but I think it also can be overstated a little bit when you don't have that guy. Vince was great to have around, but Vince could also still play. He was still playing at a high level. You don't want to just have that figurehead guy unless you're like truly that legacy player like Haslam, who's been with Miami for 20 years at this point in time. All right. That's it for today's podcast. We'll have much more coming in the future. We'll have player capsules with Glenn. We've already recorded, I think, the next 2 that will be coming out in the future. I have NBA draft guests lined up. Fingers crossed that they come through. And we'll have at least 1, maybe 2 more mailbags between now and the draft. I'll have my final thoughts and boards and all that fun stuff in the future. So please subscribe to the podcast. Please tell a friend about the podcast as well. And really appreciate ratings and reviews. Follow the show on Twitter at LockedOnHawks. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland. I also have some Patreon content, patreon.com/BT Rowland. Thank you once again for listening to the podcast, everybody. We'll see you all later in the week.